Joining me now, NBC News Justice and Intelligence correspondent Ken Dilanian here on set, and also White House correspondent Mike Memoli. Thank you so much for joining us. Mike, I do want to start with you. You have covered the Biden family for such a long time. I want to ask you, despite all of those very firm statements that a pardon wasn't coming, sources now tell NBC News that it did remain on the table, right? So what drove the president to make those public statements if that was the case?
And what's so striking, Gabe, about what the president specifically said throughout the course of the time he was asked about it was he was a candidate for re-election when he was answering those questions. And so all of this suggests that he was willing to publicly say something that he knew privately was not the case, which is our own reporting that he was still very much keeping this option open. Now, I've covered Biden, as you say, a long time, and I know that no consequential decision, whether it's about whether to run, not to run, or certainly whether to pardon his son, is made in a short span of time. These are things that the president has wrestled over, to use the term that the White House is using today, throughout the entirety of his career. So it stands to reason why a time with his son in an intimate setting, a setting with rich significance for the family in Nantucket, was what maybe pushed him over the line here. But I think that this ultimate decision would have been received very differently had we not seen those very clear public denials, even after the election, from Karine Jean-Pierre, who was unable today to even answer specifically when the president's period of wrestling began. Right. Was this something that only changed in the last weekend when our own reporting says otherwise?
Yeah, she did have a tough time answering those questions, reiterating the president's statement, essentially. And Mike, is there any sense that the president would have still issued such a sweeping pardon if Kamala Harris had won?
Well, that was an interesting moment in that conversation with Karine Jean-Pierre today and the reporters on Air Force One, because at first she did seem to indicate that this might not have happened had Kamala Harris been elected, but then she backtracked to say she didn't want to engage in hypotheticals. I would speculate to say that the president did not want to have to make this decision, and had his vice president won, had he stayed in the race and won himself, it would have at least given them more time, more options here to consider how to address this. But I also know that the president was looking at, over the last 6 years, really, even longer than that, since he lost Beau and Hunter went into the depths of addiction, his concern over his well-being has been paramount. He's been something of a real shadow over his entire presidency and his campaign before that. And so this was certainly not an easy decision, but I think the fact that he ultimately got there was not a surprise to people. It's just the way they got there and the way they're explaining it to the public that I think is why you're seeing such a strong reaction from both parties today.
That's right. And look, we've heard reaction from some Democrats, as you allude to. They've been critical of the president's decision. So does the White House acknowledge the awkward position that this is putting the party in?
No, and that's I think the real puzzling part of this is the rhetoric that they're using. Had the president, as Ken himself has made the point, simply said, "I love my son and this is in his best interest," I think the reaction would be far different today. But it is the idea of talking about a politicized justice system that is creating headaches for Democrats who are trying to regroup on so many fronts. They're trying to make a plan for how to deal with the incoming Trump administration and what his Justice Department would do. And this has given Republicans such a clear roadmap for how to respond to any and all of those Democratic charges. And with President Biden leaving office and no political support really to count on, I think it's easier for Democrats to distance themselves from him now.
Mike Memoli outside the White House. Mike, thank you. I'm joined now by Ken Dilanian here on set. Ken, what has the reaction been inside the Justice Department? Is there frustration there?
Frustration, sadness, almost despair, because, look, Mike made the crucial point. Donald Trump, for years, has been saying that the Justice Department is politicized, has been weaponized. There's no evidence for that, and DOJ officials really push back strongly on that. Now you have President Biden saying some version of the same thing, and that's what they really resent. Had he just said, I need to save my son from a potential prison sentence and retaliation by a Donald Trump Justice Department, that would have been one thing. But he said the process had been politicized, and there just isn't any evidence of that. He said the prosecution was selective. Judges have ruled that that's not the case.
Yeah, that's right. He went much further than just saying he needed to do this with his son. And on that point, I want to read a bit more of the president's statement where he mentions his plea deal, right? The DOJ deal to avoid charges. It fell apart in court. And the president writing, a carefully negotiated plea deal agreed to by the Department of Justice unraveled in the courtroom with a number of my political opponents in Congress taking credit for bringing political pressure on the process. Had the plea deal held, it would have been a fair, reasonable resolution of Hunter's cases. So remind us of the circumstances of that deal.
Yeah, it was a complicated two-step plea deal, but the bottom line that people need to know is it would have resulted in no jail time and no felony convictions for Hunter Biden. So it was a pretty good deal. And it didn't fall apart because of political pressure. It fell apart because the judge in the courtroom asked some hard questions, and it became clear that the two sides didn't agree on the scope of immunity that deal granted Hunter Biden. So it fell apart. But here's the other, there's a part two to this, which is that some version of that deal remained on the table. It wasn't the deal that Hunter Biden wanted initially, but it would have spared him jail time, spared him trials. He walked away from that. He and his lawyers decided to take their chances and go to trial in Delaware, and he was convicted of felonies. And then the process unraveled after that for him.
So this all comes amid a presidential transition. Inside that Justice Department, what is the expectation heading into this new administration? Obviously, the president-elect picking this election for FBI director, but what do they think is going to happen in the next year or so, those rank-and-file career members of the Justice Department? Yeah,
there's a lot of concern among the rank-and-file, a lot of resumes going out to law firms, people who are retirement eligible thinking about leaving. But there's also a sense that maybe people need to stay and try to uphold the norms of the Justice Department. There's just deep concern that Donald Trump and the people he appoints to these positions are going to try to politicize and do away with the independence of the DOJ, which it's a real value over there. They pride themselves on being independent of the White House, independent of politics, law enforcement officers trying to do their jobs. Even though millions of Americans don't always believe it, they believe it, and they're really concerned that that's going to be eroded under Donald Trump.
Ken Dilanian, our Justice and Intelligence correspondent. Ken, thanks so much for joining us. And I'm joined now by Carol Lam, former U.S. attorney and now an NBC News legal analyst. Thank you so much for joining us, Carol. How unusual is it for a president to issue a pardon this broad?
Well, it is highly unusual. I think that it has been reported that the only other time a president has issued a pardon that really says it's a blanket pardon, says that any offense or potential offense for which he can be prosecuted over the last 10 years is off the table now, and that the only time that's been done in the past has been President Ford's pardon of Richard Nixon. In other cases, it is always tied to the offense at issue. But I think there's a reason for President Biden having issued such a broad pardon in this case, and that is because there's always been lurking in the background the Republicans' indication that they are going to look into, and they're going to continue looking into, Hunter Biden's participation in Burisma and Ukraine events. And I think that is really what is worrying President Biden, and that is why he has issued this blanket pardon for all activities between 2014 and yesterday, saying that enough, and he says that enough is enough, I've had it. And that's really what I think we see here. We see a president who said, that's enough, I've had it.
Yeah, and notably, that pardon extends back to 2014, as you said, and that is the same year that Hunter Biden joined the board of Burisma. So does this pardon prevent a Trump Justice Department from opening or reopening any investigation into Hunter Biden?
Well, it really does. Anything that involves conduct that occurred between 2014 and yesterday, that's the nature of the pardon. It is not appealable. It cannot be revisited. That is the constitutional power that a president has. And, you know, going to the question of why did he do this about turn, having said that he would not pardon his son, why did he then yesterday go ahead and pardon his son? You know, it could be that when he made the statements before, he actually meant it. You know, remember, he had the pardon authority. He could have pardoned his son at any point in time. He let the indictments come down. He let the plea agreement fail. He didn't pardon him at that point. He let the case go to trial. He let his son plead guilty and still did not pardon him. It seems, and I suspect what happened was it was probably a bridge too far when he saw Trump saying he was going to nominate Trump's entire criminal defense team to the top positions at the Justice Department, and of course Kash Patel to the FBI. That just probably created too much fear in President Biden's mind that this would never end against his son.
And Carol, as a former federal prosecutor, do you think that Hunter Biden would have faced any of these charges if he weren't the president's son?
That's very, very hard to tell. You know, you can take criminal prosecutions and you can say, oh, that prosecution should have been brought or shouldn't have been brought. But what the public never sees, and what most people, even at the Department of Justice, don't see, are the cases that are not brought. So we don't really know what the overall field is of cases that are similar to this that were never brought. We can look at the cases that were brought, but prosecutorial discretion looms large here. And the gun charge, I think most people, experienced prosecutors agree that that was a little bit of a stretch. And that's why the department was willing initially to let him plead to a deferred prosecution. The tax charges were serious charges, and I can't say that it was outside the realm of normalcy for those charges to be brought.
Carol Lam, a former federal prosecutor, now an NBC News legal analyst. Carol, thank you so much.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.